Three-dimensional design. Okay, so in terms of image citations, unless I have otherwise mentioned it, the images, the art images come from a website called Web Gallery of Art, which actually is a really good resource for good quality images of art and design, mostly old classical artworks, but they also have a lot of modern stuff. Okay, so week one, couple of concepts before we get into our lecture. We are dealing with forms. You are building things in this course. And form, a good definition of it, is a physical manifestation of an idea. And again, you have all of these PowerPoints, so you don't need to worry about taking too many notes about what's in them. You can take notes about other things that come into your mind or things that I'm saying. So all the text you have. Okay, two principles of three-dimensional design. One is mass and one is void. Okay, void is an empty volume and mass is a filled volume. And what that looks like is, this is a mass, oh sorry, this is a void, because a bowl is a empty, hollow form. And a mass, as you can see from this sculpture, is solid. This is solid stone, and it's this huge Egyptian head that's in one of the museums in London. Okay. Basic principle of form: static forms appear stable. The pyramids do not look like they're going anywhere. They are just very stable forms, right? Dynamic forms, however, they appear to move. And this sculpture by Boccioni is designed, it's the art inspiration for this was to create a figure that looks like it was in motion, right? This is a very dynamic form. Kinetic forms actually move. And you'll remember the Chilean dresses that changed and morphed while the model was wearing it. That was very kinetic. So, principle one, and it's the principle we started with last term as well, the principle of line. However, in 3 dimensions, line takes different properties. This is a sculpture, and you can see how the line work is all of these roadways and train tracks traversing this rough-looking globe. Here in the sculpture by Laocoon and his sons, the line work is the snakes that are pulling this poor fellow back into the ocean with his 2 sons. And this sculpture was discovered, it was from ancient Greece, I believe, and was lost. It was basically buried. And then around early Renaissance, it was dug up, and it inspired sculptors like Michelangelo, who we will talk to later, because they were amazed at the realism in the incredible sculpting in the sculpture. We will talk about that more when we get to Michelangelo. Okay, this is an artist we're going to look at today, Kai Chan, and here he uses string quite a bit in his work. And that is another way to use line as a 3-dimensional aspect of your work. There he is. Okay, so Kai Chan is Toronto-based artist, and his work is very, I would say craft-based in some ways, because he uses things like threads and but he uses it in interesting ways. These are all just nails that are put into the wall, and then he lays all of these tassels one on top of the other, right, to create this sculptural installation on the wall. Same process, bigger sculpture. These are all, again, that red string, which has associations of things like Chinese New Year, right, with the tassels. There's almost like this bloody quality in a weird way. Like he uses it in an interesting visual way. And again, it's all just nails hammered into the wall, and he creates these nice curves just about where he places the nails, and then he goes back and puts the string one on top of the other to create these beautiful wall sculptures. These are sticks. I think he got them from his backyard. These things are like 6 feet tall, these sculptures. They're quite large. And then he ties them together with sticks. So it's a very involved process working on these. This is, again, the idea of the red cord, but it's much larger. And I saw this sculpture at the Textile Museum, and it's hanging from the ceiling with this knotted series of cord like this. Okay, so these are quite lovely. They almost look like spider webs. So he's doing sort of like a crochet and a knitting, but it's like these weird spidery type installations. And again, it's on a wall. These things are quite large. They're like 6 feet high. And the line work against the wall behind it really gives you the sculptural dimension of the piece just from string. So this will give you an idea of the size of these. That is a person. This is the actual wall installation of this work. Lots of applications for this in fashion, right? Like we could do a lot with techniques like this for sure. Okay, this was an installation, I think it was in Winnipeg. He went to do a residency, and he went to like a Salvation Army store downtown and found a box of old buttons. I don't know about you, but everybody in my family, like all the old aunties, always kept buttons, right? Like you always had that box of the old buttons. And so he found one of these and he made a wall sculpture out of it. These are all those buttons, and he's just nailed them into the wall, which I think is so wonderful because he's made this beautiful sculpture out of something like, while the sculpture itself is very modern and quite exciting, it also has these interesting associations with history and family and thrift, right? Like the idea even now, like everyone is starting to mend their clothes because nobody can go out and buy anything, right? Like anyone that lived through the Depression, like your great-grandparents, collects everything. Like they would collect string and foil and all kinds of stuff. And so this is kind of connects to that history. It's so interesting. Okay, these sculptures are toothpicks that he ties together with string. And so it's a combination of the shadow and the object to create these forms. Same idea, and the lighting plays a big part of the visual interest in this wall sculpture. These are almost like he's got this like mini army of archers, and they shoot all of these spikes. And I saw this sculpture as well. It's beautiful, but they're all just these wooden spikes that stick out of the wall. So it has this very dynamic engagement with the space, right? You could see the gallery owner come in and be like, oh my goodness, look at my wall. There's a million things stuck into it. It's like there's a war here. It's quite amazing. This was his opening. When you walked into this, most of the images that I'm showing you came from a show we had at the Textile Museum. And he spelled out Kai, K-A-I, on his alphabet sculpture on the wall. And so when you got off the elevator, basically, this was the first thing you saw. It led you into the show of his work. Okay, Marc de Souvero, American sculptor, works with a very heavy material. These eye-bars that you use to build buildings. These are construction materials, and he creates these really dynamic line-based forms, right? Because it's really about the movement of line, and quite graceful and bright, fun colors, but they're made out of these really heavy industrial materials. So it's a really interplay between something that's very common and rough, like to build buildings, and he makes these very almost dance, these sculptures, and some of them move with the wind. Like they're quite amazing. And this is so interesting how he's put this sculpture in this quite old courtyard. So the setting of the object, like it relates to its surroundings quite nicely. The very modern against the traditional. There's a lot. I mean, his work goes outside generally because it weighs multiple tons, and it's all very industrial, so it can handle being outside. This is one of those ones that will move with the wind. So you have these very heavy, rusty things, but they also are delicate because even a little bit of wind will cause them to move. They become kinetic, that word that we looked at earlier. This is what his sculptures look like in a gallery, and you can see how different they relate to the very smooth, clean gallery setting. This is another one, and again, it will move from the wind. These are some of his sketches, which I think are so dynamic, like they've got so much movement, and their brushwork to create ideas for his huge, heavy forms come from these very light, very quick gesture paintings. Okay, Alexander Calder. I should put his dates up there because he has passed. He was an American sculptor, and he went over to Paris in the 1950s, and his big sculptural exploration was the idea of the mobile. And a mobile is something that hangs from the ceiling and is balanced so the weight will move it around with the air currents. Again, like Marc de Souvreau was doing, Calder was doing this first, and he did it with these quite lovely mobiles. So if you see a sculpture like this in a major museum, 9 times out of 10, it is a Calder. This is one of his floor installations. And with this one, all of the weight balances out everything that's over here, right? This big weight balances all these other ones, and it will rotate around and do all kinds of interesting, cool things depending on the movement of the air. This is in the old Museum of Modern Art, and that is, I think it's called Lobster Trap, his mobile that hangs from the ceiling. That's my not so great photograph of the same sculpture. If anyone's been to Washington, D.C., this is in their National Gallery, one of the big modern galleries, and this thing weighs tons, and it is so soft how it moves just from the air conditioning in the space because it's all balanced out really beautifully. This is on, I'm pretty sure it's on Park Ave in New York, and it's another one of his mobile installations. This is his, I love this, the idea of, oops, doing the sketch, but doing it with wire. It's quite fun. I've actually done this with, when I teach sculpture, I will have my students do drawings with wire, but we don't really have time for that in this course, but if it's something you ever want to explore, it makes for a really interesting exploration. It's really fun what you can do with wire. I'm not going to make you all go out and try to find wire in a pandemic, but it is an interesting technique. Okay, Marcel Duchamp is really considered the father of modern conceptual art, the idea of art as an idea, right? Like he, as you will see, he makes things, but he also plays with thought and philosophy quite a bit. And his work really influenced what we know of as modern art, where the idea is sometimes more important than the object. So he would go find what these odd things in the garbage or whatever, and he'd put them together and make them in sculptures. And then he would like spin this. He liked kinetic work. He liked things that moved. And he was doing this in the early parts of the last century. So we're looking at like 1910s and 20s. So it was very ahead of the curve, and it opened up the idea of what could be a sculpture, right? Like people are like, why is there a stool with a bicycle wheel on it? Like, how is that a sculpture? He was like, it's the idea of it. And he opened up a lot of doors because of that. So this, normally I would take a moment in our lecture and ask the room, does anyone recognize what this is? And people would look at it for a while, and then someone would say, oh, it's a urinal. And a urinal is something that it's a toilet, right? And the story of our urinal sculpture, which is called Fountain, is that in 1917, Marcel Duchamp was on the board of a sculpture show exhibition in New York City, and their rules were that if anybody paid the admission fee to show, they would show the sculpture. So he set up a fake name for himself, R. Mutt, and you can see that's written on there. And he submitted this sculpture as to be exhibited in their group show. And they freaked out and said, we can't do this. And he was there on the board and he said, well, we have to. These are our rules. So they did end up having to exhibit it and put it behind a curtain. It is considered the first really modern piece of sculpture because nobody made it. Like the artist didn't make it. It was made in a factory. It's industrial, okay? And it's not created to be as a sculpture. It's not like a, you know, that beautiful Laocoon sculpture that was carved out of marble. This has obviously a purpose, an industrial purpose, and it's not a very nice one, right? And he took that and said, this could be a sculpture. And it really changed everything. It changed the rules of what could be considered art. And it's so interesting because the one that they have in the Museum of Modern Art in New York is not even the original. Okay, the original was thrown out or something, like it was lost over the years. So they recreated it so that they would have one. So this pivotal piece of modern sculpture is not even the original. So it's so conceptual. It's very much an idea as opposed to an object. And that is something very important when you are considering the idea of modern sculpture. Okay, this is some of his other work. He again, these all move. These are like little motors. So these twirl and spin. He loved kinetic art. And there's YouTube videos of all of his work spinning around. Like these all spin around and they're very kinetic. So not only are they dynamic, they appear to be moving, they actually are moving, which makes them kinetic. So this one is a sculpture where he took some pieces of string and he dropped them on the floor and he measured how they fell and then he carved them, like that was how the string fell, into these pieces of wood. And then he made this very big box for it and he put them in there, and that was the sculpture. So he was kind of recording the motion of dropping a piece of string. That's what this whole sculpture is about. So again, the idea, the activity is more important in some ways than the object, because you wouldn't know what this was unless you knew what the backstory was. Okay, so this is the bride stripped bare, and in this one, bride stripped bare by her suitors, also known as the large glass. This thing is, again, like 6 feet tall, and it was this silver foil cutout sandwiched between pieces of glass. And that was his sculpture slash painting. It's hard to define what it is. He didn't care about, you know, defining where it fit. This was actually a coffee grinder. That's an old coffee grinder there. It was sent out to an exhibition and it came back broken. And he loved that. He had his assistants glue it all back together again. And he thought that just made the sculpture even better because it had a dynamic aspect of having been broken as well. This is nude descending a staircase, and it's a very pivotal piece of modern art in that it shows a figure in motion. And it's hard to tell the gender of the figure. It's hard to tell there's even a figure in there. And this is definitely one of the first really modern pieces of artwork. And it becomes the inspiration for abstract art that will come later. Like there is meant to be a figure moving down the staircase here, but it really is just a very abstract image. Okay, so this is called El Acho au Cou, with my terrible French. And it's our poor Mona Lisa who has had a little beard and mustache put on her. And if you speak better French than I do, and you say Elle a au cul, it could also be heard as Elle a un chaud cul, which means she has a nice bum. And so it's very disrespectful. He was not a traditional artist. And my apologies for my terrible French. If anyone speaks French, you can open up the mic and teach me how to say that properly. Okay, so this is a YouTube channel that has a lot of his kinetic work. You can look at that later because you have your PowerPoint access. Also, there's a Vimeo that has kinetic fashion, and it shows some design work that features clothing that moves through motors and electronics. Okay, so the design principle of force is something we have to think about when we are creating three-dimensional form, because our forms are not just drawings on the page. They actually have to stand up. They have to hold up. They deal with gravity, really. So basic principles of types of force: compression is when things are squeezed, torsion is when they are twisted, tension is when things are pulling down on it. You've got bending, and then shear is when things are pulling in the opposite direction. Okay, so these are basic principles of force, and we're not exploring these in our work, but it's just something that you have to deal with as a designer of three-dimensional shape and form. Truss is a building system that uses these little inserts here to create much stronger and durable form. Okay, like these truss bridges, if they were made with just pure steel, would not be as strong. This little triangulated truss really strengthens it, and it was a major innovation in terms of engineering and building. One of our favorite buildings, the beautiful Eiffel Tower in Paris, is entirely a truss-based piece of architecture. Okay, the design and form of this building is very much directed by how it is made. The principle of truss is right in front of your face, right? Because that's how they built this tall building, was through just a series of truss work, which I find so fascinating. And I had never really looked at the Eiffel Tower that way until I learned about this principle and this building technique. Okay, Buckminster Fuller we will return to later in the term, but for today, just know that he used these truss principles basically to create the idea of the geodesic dome. So the dome form is the architectural style pioneered by Buckminster Fuller, who felt that everybody was going to be living in these domes in the future. And it is a very strong exoskeleton-based type of architecture. And we will return to him definitely in a couple of weeks. But for the moment, just know that this is a geodesic dome. Kenneth Snelson. Okay, so he is a sculptor who works with largely with line and wire and pipe. And this is one of his sculptures that you can see. These are all sticks that have been attached together, kind of like the idea, the principles that Kai Chan was working with those sticks and string. This is the same idea with this sculpture. Mainly his work, however, was the idea of the pipe and then the wire that goes through it. So our line mark here is this wire that connects the form, and none of these pipes are actually attached to each other. Everything is held together by the tension of the wire, and that is the whole principle of his sculptural exploration, right? The idea of what you can do with a pipe and a wire. And in the past, I've had students do explorations with string and straws to play around with this idea of this tension, that allows these sculptures to stand up off the floor and look solid when in fact they are just a series of wires that are threaded through these pipes. Same idea here. Nothing is actually attached to anything else. It is all just wire working and threaded through these pipes to create all of this structure that creates this dome. Oops. If you recall, talked about the idea of cantilever when we were looking at falling water, the Frank Lloyd Wright house outside of Chicago, that beautiful one that was built out over the river that ran through it. This is also cantilevered. It's attached at one side, and then it oops, spreads out this way, but it's only attachment to the earth is here, and everything else is just tension and gravity to create these forms. This is cantilevered and then projects out over this water. So the reflective surface, the environment, everything plays a big part in how you view this beautiful sculpture. Same sculpture, different times of the day. So environmental work is always affected by things like the elements, the seasons, the light, and it affects how the sculpture is viewed. Okay, Dennis Oppenheim. So his work is based on basically a type of truss. It's like these prefab forms, like you'd make your shed, but he then takes it to a totally new level to create these sculpture installations. So there are large pieces, those are like buildings in the background, so you get the size of it. And he uses, traditional building construction technique to create these crazy, wonderful sculptural forms, right? These are some of his rings, and this is in New York City. You can see them. I think these are downtown, and they've lit up the top form of rings. And he has done these in other locations as well. There's another one in a different place. We're going to revisit this at the end of the lecture. His this little country church that ends up steeple pointing into the dirt like it's been picked up by a tornado is another sculpture that he has installed in various places. Quite wonderful. Okay, Cho Ho-sa is a Korean sculptor, and the work here is all done with textiles and sewing, but it's recreations of environments, which I think is just fascinating. And this is the really beautiful painting sketch for this sculpture. And so this is all just done with sewing, right? And soft materials, quite wonderfully. Fantastic piece of sculpture. These are all little figures in here, if you look close, holding up these big glass panels. And people are standing on it, as you can see. There we go. And those are our little figures that are holding you up. I find this work so interesting because it uses fashion and uniform and a lot of the things that we deal with as design and fashion people, and it uses them in a sculptural way to tell messages and create interesting narratives, which I think is quite amazing. This, I believe, is a replication of the apartment that he lived in Brooklyn. This one of his sculptures, that the whole thing was just like an exact replica of his apartment in this soft, soft fabric, almost like a tent feeling. Okay, so the corset. I tried to find the closest fashion connection to the idea of the truss. And I came up with the idea of the corset, which is this shaped garment that basically pulls in the waist and reshapes the body. And through the centuries, women have used corsets underneath their clothing, and there's lots of debate about health issues versus, all kinds of other things of these wardrobe items. And Jean-Paul Gaultier is a French designer who has often used the corset as a place to start. He did the Madonna tour wardrobing, the Blonde Ambition tour. That was based on an old 1950s underwear style, and it was worn as outerwear. He uses a lot of corseted type shaping in his clothing design. He's an interesting designer in terms of there's a lot of multicultural, I'd say, influence in his work, and it does open up discussions around cultural appropriation versus inspiration. And I think he generally is pretty respectful of the cultures that he is in fact inspired by, and he does include them. He's not trying to hide the source, so I think that he actually falls on the side of a more creative way to be inspired by other cultures, because as designers, you can't live in fear of never looking at anyone else's cultures, because culture is beautiful. The problem with appropriation is taking other people's cultures and then not giving them any credit, right? Which he does not do. He definitely does these inspirations as a way of celebrating other culture. And I think that that is the way to go if you are going to use cultural elements that are not from your own culture. Make sure you research it and understand what you are doing with them. Okay? Because as designers, we should be inspired by everything. I mean, it's a big world out there. I don't want you to be censored or feel trapped. Like culture is beautiful, but just always be very aware of what you are using in other people's cultures. Like, do the homework. There's Dita Von Teese, the famous vaudeville star, burlesque star with Jean-Paul Gaultier, and she is a big fan. You'll recall we talked about Elsa Schiaparelli last term during Surrealism. This is kind of inspired by Schiaparelli's skeleton dresses, this Dita Von Teese corset. Okay, so we looked at that house that kind of looked like it had a face. And that is when something is anthropomorphic. That is a $10 word that basically means like you are assigning human characteristics to non-human, non-living things, okay? So things like the doorknobs, I think this is Beauty and the Beast, that are talking, that is anthropomorphic. This little sad potato, this is how I felt when I woke up this morning and had to go to my meeting. That was me. I was like that poor anthropomorphic potato. This is a house that looks like a face and a tongue. Look at this, all of a sudden you see faces. I have a friend that like all she does is look for faces in other people's cars, like the way the lights and the front of the car, back of the car is designed. She's like, oh, look at that one. She says they all look like faces to her. Haha. That's always going to put you in a good mood. Is it a bowl of vegetables? Is it a portrait? It's both. These are by Arcimboldo, and he loved to make portraits of people made entirely out of fruits and vegetables and natural elements. And I think 1567, so we're in the mid 1500s for these. Okay, so part one of our homework is I want you to track down some anthropomorphism in the world. You can go around the house and see where you can find faces in things.